The British people have spoken, and the answer is we're out.
Sky News is projecting that the UK has voted out. The UK electorate has taken the historic decision to withdraw from the European
Brexit
Union
has opened
after
up a
more than
debate we
40
haven't had
years.
for over 70 years. The big issues about our identity, control over our borders, and where we are in the world all hangs around food and farming. My name's Charlie Clutterbuck, and from about the age of 12 I wanted to feed the world. I worked for a group called the British Society for Social Responsibility in Science, during which time I set up a magazine called Hazards, which put my expertise and others along with the experience of workers in trying to demonstrate the hazards of their work, particularly of complex chemicals. After that, as part of my expertise about pesticides, I was to work for the government's Advisory Committee on Pesticides. I also have worked as an advisor to the government on food security following the food crisis of 2008-2009. Since then, I've campaigned for improved food, particularly sustainable food and more local food. We take food for granted. We just go to the supermarket, we buy it as cheaply as possible, we stick it down our faces, and we don't think any more about it. Yet food is one of the most political issues. If we look back 200 years, we may see some similarities as to what's going on today. Then the Corn Laws were taxes put on grain coming from the rest of the world. The landowners wanted to keep them, while the factory owners wanted rid of them so they could provide cheaper food. The issue divided the Conservative Party and caused a major political divide that went on for over 100 years.
What you are suggesting, Prime Minister, will be the death of British agriculture.
There are more people living in our towns now than in the countryside, Stanley. Free trade is the only way to make food affordable to everyone.
I gave my word as a gentleman to uphold the Corn Laws, and I am not in the habit of breaking my word.
After 30 years of division and debate, Robert Peel was successful in repealing the Corn Laws. As we can see from some of these posters, this was quite a politically charged issue. This divided the country. It also led to the massive long-term decline of UK farming. As we approached the First World War, there were clear signs of tension about free trade. In particular, foreign workers, cheap foreign imports, and trade deficits, all of which sounds remarkably similar to today's political climate. At the beginning of the First World War, we produced only a quarter of our own food. During the wars, it became obvious that we couldn't rely on other people producing our food. It was only after the Second World War that the Agricultural Act invested in farming such that farming improved and increased production up until the 1970s. However, Brexit might change all that, and that is why I decided to write a book called Bittersweet Brexit. That while Brexit opened up opportunities, there may also be many downsides, and food and farming didn't seem to be represented in that debate. So I wrote the book on that basis, looking at the opportunities and the problems which Brexit might challenge farming in this country. After the war, there was a government consensus between all parties that farmers would get proper recognition for what they grew, guaranteed prices. However, in the 70s, that all went astray when the policy really became let the supermarkets or markets decide. And that really is driven to ever cheaper food. And the consumers want cheaper food, let's not ignore that. But that has consequences. One of which is that half the food we eat by value now comes from abroad. That has doubled since the 1970s, when only a quarter of the food came from abroad. What that does is put pressure on our food and farming processes. We overproduce food in the world by enormous amounts. That means the markets are always saturated, the food is cheap. New Zealand can produce cheap lamb. America produces cheap corn. Argentina produces cheap beef. We can't compete with that. So that comes into our markets, and our farmers have to try and compete with that. And the only way they can do it is to get ever cheaper. And the consequences of that, if you are in business, how do you make that food cheaper? Predominantly, you look at the major cost of that production, and that cost is usually labour. If we want to produce more food, we're going to have to pay people more to do that, especially if they want to work in decent conditions. We're going to have living wages.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in 2 weeks' time, this House will debate the Public Bodies Bill, which abolishes the Agricultural Wages Board, which sets paying conditions for 150,000 farm workers in England and Wales. If the AWB...
The Agricultural Wages Board is an example in point that up until 2013, farm workers were paid slightly more than the minimum wage, and any skills they gained were included in their wages. Unfortunately, the government of the time decided that that was too much. Pushed by, unfortunately, the National Farmers Union and these plantation owners, they wanted to pay the workers minimum wages. So they did away with the Agricultural Wages Board. Curiously enough, it was the England and Wales Agricultural Wages Board, and the Welsh Assembly didn't want to get rid of it. So they've maintained something similar. Scotland have maintained their wages board, as have Northern Ireland. So here is a really good example of how the various forms of agriculture, this plantation sort of agriculture, has driven conditions down, but only in England. Most people ignore the labour consequences. We'll go into a supermarket, we'll pick up a cauliflower with a Union Jack on it and think that's fine, not realising it's cheap labour that has produced that cauliflower. In particular, in the eastern side of the country, in the fields which I call the plantations, where we've got massive acres of monocultures picked predominantly by migrant workers. This is one of the issues that led to Brexit. If we compare these two maps, on the left we see British farming with the arable areas, that's the yellow blob, consists of ploughed land growing the grains and vegetables. On the right, the map is of the predicted Brexit vote, that is the one 2 months before the actual referendum, where you can see the deepest red is again in the same area as that of the arable land. Although this is a predicted map of Brexit, those areas actually voted 3-1 in favour of Brexit. As a consequence, we have now moved towards Brexit, but people still seem to want to have migrant workers picking those crops. And they're talking about bringing people from Russia, from the Ukraine, from Thailand. What I would argue is we need to be producing that food in a different way altogether, with properly paid workers working in conditions which are decent, more akin, if you like, to gardening than to plantations. One of the consequences of coming out of Europe is that up till now, we have things called a CAP payments, the Common Agricultural Policy Subsidies. This amounts to about £3 billion worth, about £100 an acre if you own over 10 acres. So if you've got a back garden or an allotment, forget it. But if you've got more than 10 acres, you get your £100 an acre. It means the more land you own, the more subsidies you get. So the Duke of Westminster, who owns about 4,000 acres just up the road, or up the lane, he gets £400,000. The Queen next door to him gets about £250,000. Some people think that all farmers get these subsidies. Unfortunately, not all get these subsidies. If you're a tenant farmer, i.e. you're on somebody else's land, then the landowner doesn't necessarily give that tenant farmer the £100 per acre. And so the Small Tenants Association complain about this quite a lot, that their members are not getting the just rewards. At the moment, all that money goes to landowners. And it goes to landowners for doing nothing. They don't have to do anything other than fill the forms in. I would argue that money will be much better spent paying workers on the land. That includes farmers and farm workers. And what I propose in the book Bittersweet Brexit is that about 300,000 of them, which is about the total working population on our land, should each get about £10,000 each extra. That would bring their wages up into living wage status, which I believe in the long term would encourage more people to work on the land. And we especially need young people to work on the land and see their careers on the land. Because if we don't, we're not going to have anybody to work the land in a few years. At the moment, the average age of farm workers is 59. Well, you can imagine it, having a conversation in 10 years' time, they are not going to be there. So we need to be educating more people to come onto the land. This chart shows the population demographic of rural and urban areas. As you can see from the bulge on the left-hand side of the chart, older people make up the majority of people in rural areas, and this is unsustainable. While we can get by for the next couple of years quite happily, I'm looking 30 or 40 years ahead and thinking, where are we going to be? What is our countryside going to look like? Where is our food going to come from then? And I'm very despondent because we're not investing in the people or the land in order to deliver the sorts of food we really need in 30 or 40 years' time. Subsidising farm workers obviously benefits those workers having a living wage, but it also brings about a lot of other benefits in terms of what we want to grow and where. At the moment, what is grown is at the play of the markets. In the future, we need to have more sustainable food, in other words, better for the environment and better for the local economy. So we can use those subsidies going to farm workers to pay those workers what we want done. In other words, if we want more apples picking, we pay them to pick the apples. If we want more vegetables growing, we pay them to grow and produce more vegetables. And we do this locally so that local economies benefit, but also the health for people improves. Everybody knows we need to eat more fruit and vegetables, but what are we doing? We're importing them, or cheap labour is picking them on these monocultures. One of the benefits of subsidising farm workers is that those wages will then get fed back into the local economies, in the pubs and in the cafes and in the restaurants. It's calculated that for every pound spent here, another £10 stick in terms of that cafe or restaurant buying the paint, buying the builders, buying the whatever. So the economy generally improves. So the figure we remember was that £3 billion spent by the EU at the moment subsidising our landowners would be much better spent with the workers, which would put it back into the local communities, so the local communities would benefit to the tune of £30 billion. That's a lot of money in terms of building an economy. And that would lead to the other major point we find in the Bittersweet Brexit book, is that we need to reduce those food imports by the tune of about £33 billion. Our food deficit of food exports to food imports is £33 billion. That's my target, is to reduce that figure so that instead of spending 30 odd billion pounds to people abroad, we spend 30 billion pounds on ourselves. And I can't help but think a lot of people in this country would see the value of that in terms of building our economy and employing people at the same time. Now, we don't have to come out of Europe in order to do that. Other countries in Europe don't use their subsidies in the same way, and the whole form of EU subsidies on CAP is being discussed at the moment. There's a consultation lasting about a year. Part 2 of this film covers other aspects of food and farming, including environmental impacts, processed food and obesity, and trade and tariffs.